Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk. My name is Mariam Umar. I am based in London. I've been in the field of quality assurance since the beginning of my career. It basically started for me when I did a course as my degree, as a part of my degree on software testing, and that's where my real love for software testing came through. Today I want to share some experiences with yourselves. Hopefully we can have a nice fiery Q&A afterwards with Astrid and myself and see how we can cross emotions and the analytical um, aspect of improving quality in your organization. Okay. So what will we talk about? First, we will talk about what is it that the problem you're trying to solve in your organization, and then how can you get started on improving quality. After that, we will talk about some metrics which you can use to measure quality and see how you feel about those. I'll present some examples as well where things worked well and things did not work well. And in the end, we will also talk about evolving metrics based on what we learn in an organization. So, first things first, I'm sure all of you have gone through this. Whenever you've been hired by an organization as a QA engineer, QA manager, QA tester, or DevOps tester, or something like that, these are some of the statements you hear. A lot of things I hear: we have a lot of quality issues. Can you please come and fix them? Oh, our clients are really unhappy. Our releases are delayed and are not on time. They don't contain all the features that our clients wanted, or there are too many production incidents, and so on. And these are the statements you hear a lot, and they just want you to go in and fix them. So, where do you actually start? The three things you need to remember before you embark on this journey. First things first, when you want to improve the quality of the product you're working on, it cannot happen with the QA team only. A lot of the times, in my experience, I find that having the word QA in your job title or tester in your job title just completely puts you in a corner that these are the people who will fix quality. Everybody else is just going to follow what they say. That cannot happen. You have to have a whole team approach for improving quality. You have to have everybody bought into the idea of how you want to improve quality, because it really starts from the beginning of the STLC, where you start writing your requirements and go from there. Second thing, improving quality needs a top down approach. And what I mean by this is, it's not only the managers who need to say it, it's your CEO, it's your CTO, it's your CIO. All of these people in your organization need to be bought into the whole idea. There have been occasions when I have been in organizations where I was asked to work on improving quality, but the CEO and CTO were not really interested in helping me, say, create the resources or give the time in terms of estimation and how much time we need to actually add automated tests, or spend the time to really do 3 Amigo style sessions and so on. So they need to also say all of these things out loud to the wider organization, because those are your true allies who will help you implement quality on the ground. And the last thing is, once you have these people helping you and everybody's understanding that it's not with the QA team only, you need to first figure out where is your situation with quality. Where are we today? Don't go in and start implementing automated tests as that's the first thing we need to do. It's usually the first thing you need to do, but it's also sometimes a symptom, and that's not the cause of the problem. So please make sure you also look into discovering what the current situation is. So once we have this, we need to create an action plan. And my inspiration for the action plan comes from the book Leading Quality, written by Ronald Cummings John and Away Spear. Please, as I said earlier, please get the book, read it. It's a really easy read. It really helps you understand. A lot of things will resonate with you, but it will also help you create an action plan for your organization. So the first thing I usually do is creating a mission statement. And I feel these are quite important. mainly to try and understand what direction you want to go in terms of improving quality. This is a mission statement I've come up with in the past couple of organizations I've worked at. And basically, it talks about enabling teams for customer satisfaction at a sustainable pace, which actually looks at three different aspects of quality, which is enabling teams, is where you can think about quality engineering in the engineering teams. Customer satisfaction is, you can look at it as quality assurance for your releases. And sustainable pace, which is something we don't often review, is the are the processes that we use in our STLC. I know even those need to be of high quality. I wouldn't say they necessarily need to be revised by a QA person, but really having your, say, Scrum Masters or program managers and these people on board in trying to improve the processes and actually measure if the processes you're using are working or not to actually improve quality as a whole. So the next thing you want to do is once you create a mission statement, you want to try and analyze what are the overall areas you want to improve in an organization. And these are the areas which I usually have seen. The areas for your organization may be different, which is okay, but it's the first thing you want to look at. Um, some of the things you want to look at how the hiring has been for the people in the QA team. Sometimes, if you think about scale ups, they've started with manual testers, and then as they've scaled rapidly, the number of testers hasn't increased, the culture hasn't changed, and you really need to start writing automated tests because regression sign off is taking too long. So you need to review what type of people you're hiring. Another big one is releases. How are you actually mapping out releases? What's going into a release? Let's say 20 people were churning out 10 features for a release. Can 100 people churn out 50 features or not? What is the scale? And really try and understand how can we sign those features off as long as we're also tackling tech debt at the same time. The third thing is test automation. This is usually an area of concern because over time, what happens is that the tests that we write initially stop helping us detecting defects. And the idea of test automation is not only to speed up the process of sign off and ensure that whenever we make code changes, none of the problems none of the bugs creep in, but you also want to make sure that they will reliably catch defects earlier on in the life cycle. And sometimes it can be a matter of reviewing the tests and actually removing some tests because they just bring no value. Another one is product quality and process quality. Here again, I will talk a little bit more about metrics under product quality, that what are the ways you can actually measure whether the product is of high quality or not. And I will also talk about what are the things you can look at to improve your processes and their quality overall. So these are some of the things you can think of in your organization that you want to improve the overall quality of the product. First thing we'll discuss, I will not talk about just earlier, I will not talk about hiring in this specific talk because I think that's a whole other subject of how do you find a good tester or an SET to hire in your organization. I will talk about the more product and process side of things for this talk. First thing is for releases. Some of the problems I've seen are that sometimes when you go in an organization, either there's a proper release schedule already defined, or releases are going out, but the engineers are just not aware of when they're going out. And at that time, I think it's really important to create a visibility landscape for releases. Basically, what you can do is it can be something very simple like adding release dates in everybody's calendars, just so that everybody knows when they're going to go out, just so that teams can better prepare for things like in case they need to be available for incidents or if it's a major release and on call and so on. Other things you want to do is you want to monitor issues found post release versus pre release. And things like this can really help you understand how good your regression cycle is. And this is where the idea of escape defects also comes in. Then, with regards to releases, release notes are also extremely important. I have worked in places where we didn't create release notes or created release notes just stating these are the new features, but not really highlighting these are the known issues. Another thing organizations also do is that they highlight known issues, but then as a consumer, I don't know when to expect fixes for those issues. And this can be based on this can be for any product you're using. It could be for the Slack app on your phone or your iOS or Android OS updates and so on. You always see a list of what are the new features, what can you expect, and you can actually use that to guide yourself as a consumer whether you even want to install that update or not. The next thing is that you want to also review how easy is it to create the deployables in your release, because if it takes too long to actually create the package which the customer needs to deploy on their machines, then it's not a very successful release, because then what you have to do is then you have to add support, your service management team needs to be available and so on. So how can you actually help them? Because again, this is all part of a customer experience as well, and I feel releases are the first point of contact for a customer. It happens even before they actually install your product, which is why a lot of these things are really important and should be of high quality as well. Some examples of what a visibility landscape can look like is, as I mentioned, this can be like a calendar. You can actually say when we are having internal releases, when are we actually having a release sent out to the client, and so on. And this can be a shared calendar in your organization. Another thing is, if you work on a product company, what also happens is that sometimes you lose track of what versions are we supporting and which ones we're not. So you could just add information like this on your Confluence page with a list of releases. Another one is when you have multiple environments for multiple clients. It could be that you work in a SaaS situation, but not always. You could have clients which use different versions of your product, which you are responsible for deploying. So it's also good to show what version of which release do they have on their machines and when was it deployed, just so that it helps you stay on top. Something like this is really useful for people, for engineers who are on call, and also for service management, just so that everybody's on the same page. For testers, this is really important as well, because what it helps us do is really identify how many environments we want to set up for our pre-prod environments and how many sanity test suites we need to run and we need to keep on top of to make sure that they don't start failing for any reason, or at least have the ability to spin them up very quickly. The next one is process quality, and there can be a number of processes you can review for your organization. I've listed a few. Big one for QA folk is defect management process. A lot of organizations don't look at creating defects during the sprint just because your story wasn't complete. And the tester managed to find some defects while writing automated tests. the I'm always in two minds about whether you want to help people raise defects during the sprint or when the sprint ends and the feature's completed. Mainly because then, if you want to measure if you're finding the maximum number of defects during development versus when the product is released, if you don't have that initial number, then you can't really say that the quality of your product is increasing or decreasing, or your life cycle is better or not. It's really up to the teams, but if the team does decide that we're not going to raise defects in cycle, then you need to find a way to link the defects that were found after they were released to the features that they are linked to. Next one is product feature sign off process. Again, this is important. It's probably part of definition of done as well. The reason why I separate this here is because sometimes when you're signing off a product feature, you also want to make sure that other product features which need to come before it, all the remaining feature flags are also switched on. Definition of done could probably mean things like the acceptance criteria are met and we have, say, X amount of test coverage and so on. But it will not necessarily point things out that we need three features to be working together to be able to have a complete user journey, for example. So both of these processes are quite important. Also, it's important to add that you need to always add the types of stakeholders that you want to engage with at these levels. Another one is definition of ready. This one is not something which is widely used, but I find that the absence of it is actually what creates a lot of problems later on in the SDLC. And this is where you really need to define things like what level of detail do you want for your acceptance criteria. Often we see engineers create stories saying, fix this and link it to a feature in Jira, and you're like, fix what in that feature? I, as a QA, don't know what I'm signing off. So it needs to have detailed acceptance criteria. Again, sometimes definition of ready may mean that it needs to be funded by a client, otherwise we cannot pick that feature up for development. Or definition of ready could also mean that we need to make sure that there's a three amigos session done with product QA and the tech lead person in the team before we are happy to sign off. It could also mean that we want to make sure that there's a relevant estimate added to that feature and it's in line with our estimation practices in the organization and so on. Other items for process quality are code review practices. um, this is really important as well because when you're trying to do a code review, you want to make sure that one, people who've written the code are not part of the code review, which is primary. It sounds silly, but it's really important. Then people who are, say, pairing on the same piece of code should not be the ones reviewing it. You want a fresh pair of eyes looking at it. Another one could be that you want to make sure that the actual code that it's being reviewed, it doesn't go over X number of lines. If it's too big of a code review that needs to be done, then it'll definitely not get done quickly, and then your branch will get out of date and so on, which creates lots of problems. Then you can also look at making sure that the pull request that you're raising, it's actually being run on your CI system and it's passing and there are no linting errors, the coverage meets a certain expectation, and only then can you commence on a code review and so on. So these are the things which are really important to define in terms of your process for code review. The next one is definition of acceptance criteria. Sometimes I find that more recently I've been trying to tackle the problem of functional coverage over unit or code coverage, unit test coverage or code coverage. And basically, the what happens is that if you have a really big organization and everybody's defining acceptance criteria in different ways, then how are you going to know that you have 100% functional coverage? Because you want to make sure that all the functionality is covered and signed off properly. And one way of doing that is to link it with the acceptance criteria in your code. I actually, my previous team, which I worked in, the SDETs actually came up with a way of defining a feature decorator, which you could add on top of the test so that they could say, okay, for AC1, this is the test that was written, for feature one, this was the test that was written, and it was really easy to use that information and create a level of functional coverage. Next one is test automation practices. Again, you want to be careful about defining this in terms of how many tests do you want to write at end-to-end level, how many integration tests you want to write. um, are you duplicating tests, are your tests taking too long to run, or are they slowing down, are they actually being written in parallel with the code and so on. Where are you actually creating your test plans, can you automate the creation of test plans and so on. And the last but not the least is estimation. You really want to come up with a uniform way of estimating your code, estimating your stories. Make sure everybody who can be a stakeholder is on the table. Often QA folk are not involved. Often, as a QA person myself, I used to be sitting at the table and I was like, I have no idea how much effort it's going to take to implement this piece. I can have an idea of how much it's going to take to test, but really it's also great way of learning about the intricate details about a feature. The next one is selecting metrics, which is the favorite part, my favorite part of this journey that I've been on. And this is really where I said initially that we want to talk about how do you know where you are with quality in an organization. And it's very good to say that we want to achieve, say, 100% coverage, separate topic of discussion as well. But you also want to find out why you want to get 100% test coverage, where it actually be able to tell you that the quality is great of the product. And even before you do that, you want to find out where you are today and where you want to get to. Because otherwise, you don't know if you're actually improving or you've actually reduced the quality of the product. So there can be a number of metrics that you can select in order to assess the software quality. Software quality. My inspiration for this has mostly come from these two sources. Um, the book Accelerate, if you've not read it, again, it's a great read. And if you can't find the time to read the book, the State of DevOps report, or DORA, which is now, as it's now called, is also available freely. It's, I think, a 20-30 page report, which actually talks about what are the types of the things high functioning organizations look at measuring, and what's a way of saying that these are the things that can help you determine whether the quality of product they're producing is great or not. So there's a lot of metrics you can measure to determine the product quality. I will talk about a few here. The first one is MTTG, or mean time to green. Basically, here is what you need to measure here is how long does it take your branch to go from red to green. As we are writing code and committing code to our branches as teams or individuals, it's normal to expect that it will go red. There will be some compilation issues or deployment issues or even code issues, and that's fine. But then how long can you actually take to recover from that redness to a green build? The reason why you want to measure this is because this one will really help you understand how will you respond, what is your team's responsiveness in production when there's a P1 incident. Because it is a classic case of um, as with testing, we're told that if you can write a small test case for a small problem, then if you multiply it, the same principles should apply. So it's a similar principle here, that you want to try and understand how long it will take for a P1 or a P2 incident to resolve by your team. And you can actually use this information to provide an idea to your service management team that this is the SLA we'd like to adhere to as an organization. Sometimes the number you quote may not be the best one, which is okay, but that's where your improvement for quality comes in. Another one I want to look at is test coverage. This one is the one which has often had a lot of conversation in the industry, mainly because a lot of people talk about 100% test coverage, but 100% test coverage can also mean nothing, in the sense that you can actually write tests but have no assertions in them. That's very easily done. What I feel that us QAs really need to focus on is not 100% coverage, but 100% functional coverage. And that's where you want to make sure that all the functions that we're saying our um, product should exhibit are actually working 100% of the time. Then another one is PR commit rate per sprint. This one is really interesting because sometimes this one is a good way of detecting if you have many waterfalls in your team. Because what happens is, let's say you have a typical 2 week scrum, 2 week sprint, and your team starts creating pull requests, and most of the pull requests land on the last day. That really means you're not giving the team the time to test properly. You're not really thinking about your test scenarios. You're not doing any exploratory testing. You're not doing any bug bashes and so on. So you want just a consistent rate of PR commits, probably lower in the beginning of the sprint because you're probably doing a lot of team ceremonies with regards to estimation and planning then. But as you move forward, what you really want to avoid is the maximum number of commits landing on the last day. Another one is QA kickback. This is not something I was aware of until one of my colleagues mentioned it to me. And this is really about calculating how much a story moves from the QA column to the dev column, and how much that seesaw is moving. What this helps highlight is that if a story is going back and forth too much, it really means that either the engineer is not even running the code before they're committing it for testing, or there are acceptance criteria missing, or we've had deployment issues every time we've tried to deploy that feature, and so on. And it really is a good conversation starter for teams to discuss during their retrospectives. Some other metrics you can think of, the percentage of flaky tests. You also want to make sure that as you're adding automated tests, the number of flaky tests is not getting higher and higher. This is something which does happen quite often, but it's important to keep an eye on this. And what you don't want is that teams start saying, oh, especially in the UI world, I see a lot of flaky tests keep happening. And then they say, oh, I know why this is failing. It passes every time when I run it manually. So I'm just going to comment this out. And that scenario never gets added to your manual regression testing suite. So it's things like that that you don't want to reduce. You should be able to tackle it. And this is where your addressing of tech debt should really happen. Other ones, the second last one, which is really interesting as well, is defects found via automation or via exploratory testing for a feature. Sometimes, and I feel that as QAs we should always be open to this, sometimes automation is not always the best way of discovering defects in a feature. um, Maybe because the tooling developed is not great for that piece, it's a new part of the our tech world. Or for example, I remember I used to work on some NoSQL databases back in the day, and there weren't really a lot of tools developed at the time for test automation. So I used to do a lot of exploratory testing on those big data sets, which is fine. It was time consuming, but I felt that as a team we were able to find more defects that way. Sometimes doing bug bashes on new APIs is better than writing lots of automated tests in the beginning. Maybe the number of automated tests needs to be really low just to cover one happy and one edge case. Maybe that's what will work for that API, and so on. So I feel this is something we should measure, not necessarily every day, every sprint, but something you should be aware of, because there's a lot of energy spent in writing test automation, but then an equal amount of energy will also start going into maintaining those tests, whereas that energy could be spent on better creating exploratory testing techniques for those features. Lastly, team feedback. Um, the thing with quality assurance is that how it's quantitative in some ways, it's also qualitative. What I mean by that is, when you say, when you ask someone how is the quality of this product, some of it is how they feel when they use a product, and some of it is what they see, which is more tangible. So a team may be, say, producing lots of APIs and creating new screens which integrate with those APIs and so on. But they may feel that, yes, all of it is implemented and it's working, but I'm not really happy with the UI. It's too clunky. It takes too many clicks for, say, a user to submit a form and so on. So, getting that type of team feedback is really important. And not only from the engineers, from your customers as well. It's really important to engage with them as to how they feel the product quality is, how the release quality was, how is the communication, how are they finding the information, the documentation, and so on. And these are the things which can really help you gauge what are the things you want to measure for product quality. Here are some graphs that I've looked at in my previous organization. This first one actually indicates the first time we had 1,000 builds a day, which is a big achievement for any small startup, because as you're creating your own CI tooling and you're moving forward, it's a big win. And also, it's great to see how much time it took to actually execute that build. Another one was how long it takes. So for initially we used to have about 40 minutes of queuing, or about 2 hours of queuing for a bill, but then there was a lot of work that was done, and then we got it down to 5 minutes really, which was really useful because you want to enable fast feedback. Then another one was test greenness. Often we have a lot of automation running in our builds, but then how often are they green? Um, what's interesting to see is that in this particular organization, there was trunk based development. And so dev was expected to be not green all the time, but mostly green. But staging environment was far more important to make green because that's where we will take the release cut from. Whereas for pre-prod environments, they were really for us and not specifically where we will take a cut from. These were environments where we just make sure that we have various versions of our product available, just so that in case we want to run tests on them, they are working. So staging was the one which was most important for us, and I think the numbers went even higher for dev later on as we did a lot of work for this. Oop, apologies. Um, Another one for me was when we actually started measuring the ratio of manual tests versus automated tests, because we wanted to try and understand what team needs the most amount of support during regression testing week before release. And this was a graph that I used to create to determine the scope of manual versus the ratio of manual versus automated tests. Because when I joined, the regression testing week used to take 2 weeks, but then we prioritized doing this work, and then we managed to bring it down to half a day for every release candidate, which was brilliant. Sometimes the defects we choose are also not always useful, and this is an example of that. In my head, I actually said, okay, I want to determine that the number of tests we write actually helps us detect a lot of defects. And this is an example of that. You would expect that if the number of tests a team has written is really high, the number of defects found in that team would be really low. But when I started to chalk that out for various teams, this metric made no sense. Because if you can see, the contracts team also had 24 defects, as well as the workflows team, even though they had a lot of tests, and this team had very few tests. So this metric was really inconclusive, and I stopped looking at this metric because this just didn't give me enough information. If anything, it should pointed out to me that probably the right tests have not been written, which is why we're finding defects here. And I was wondering whether, as part of defect resolution, are we actually adding automated tests or not? This was another graph which was showing us how many defects we were finding over time, and how many were critical and how many were high for every team. It was also showing us how many defects we're finding after release cutoff for every release. And as it went higher, of course, the CEO, CTO, everybody was really worried that the reason that they were also going higher was that the number of people in the teams were also increasing, and the number of features we were delivering were also increasing. So obviously, if there's more code, there will be more defects. um, Sometimes visualizations like these also are very useful because it helps people understand that for this release, these are the types of defects we were finding, and then you can actually do a calculated and have an informed decision making about what type of work you want to do for defect management. Um, as I go towards the end, something which I really think is important to talk about is psychological safety when it comes to bringing numbers on the table. Um, and this is a very interesting quote by Edwards Deming, which says, "Wherever there is fear, you will get wrong figures." I remember once in an organization, there were some program managers who said, we're going to measure how many defects were not started by all teams at any given time, which means that they weren't addressing them. What did the teams do? They went in and clicked the defect and dragged it into in development. Nobody's going to go across looking at 50 teams, looking at what they've done. And the numbers were wrong. It's very important that when you start looking at numbers, like I said before, everybody needs to think of them as being safe. It's not a way of measuring people's performance or team performance. It's really to understand what part of the product can we make better. The conversation always needs to be product centric rather than people centric. So, a few things that I can mention which can make metrics safe are that you want to make sure that the teams or the tech lead managers are the people you're working with to create the vision and also discussing what you want to measure. Then the task of the testing team is to make quality visible. It's not to pinpoint people's faults, but only to say, okay, we feel that this is where the product isn't stable. Can we all get together and try and identify what use cases are missing and work together on that? And let your teams develop their own targets. QA people or managers should really go in and define and say we need 100% code coverage. Let the team decide that. The only thing they should be looking at is that if all the functionality we're telling the client works is actually working or not, which is why I spoke about functional coverage. And we should always talk about metrics as part of our regular retrospectives, as to if this information that was discovered that was collected in the past sprint, was it useful or not? Is there anything we need to address as a result of this? Do we need to highlight that we need more capacity for, say, defect fixing, or do we even need to have a no feature sprint and so on? Engage with the people and make sure they're involved in helping to define the metrics and making them safe. So, in conclusion, it's important to understand that quality is subjective. Um, it depends on a lot of factors, and it can not only depend on how the teams feel or how your clients feel. So, make sure that you look at it in that way. Try and create a vision so that everybody's behind that vision and you can all gather around it and discuss what parts of it need addressing. Select some metrics and start measuring them. Also be open to the selection of metrics being wrong, and also be open to determining that we need to evolve this metric because it's not giving us in results that will help us improve the product quality as we go on. I hope this talk really helped all of you in some way. If you have suggestions or metrics you've used before, feel free to reach out. Feel free to reach out for any help or any advice or any conversations. My LinkedIn and Twitter handle are there. And I hope you really enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much, QA Global Summit. It's been an amazing day so far. I've watched some of the talks as well, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more for the next day as well. Thank you.